terms of employment law, that links into the definition of disability, as I say. Now, the normal definition for disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment, and that impairment has, I think the phrase is, substantial and long-term adverse effects. Now, they are adverse effects on their day-to-day activities, not just work activities. However, it's worth remembering, specifically people with cancer, as well as other conditions, but specifically cancer, are deemed to be covered effectively from the point of diagnosis, rather than from the point where the condition starts to have these significant adverse effects. So essentially, employees with cancer are protected from the point of diagnosis, and it's worth remembering, whilst in remission. There have been cases that have argued about precancerous lesions, that kind of thing, but the employee has won that particular case. So it is point of diagnosis and in remission. Now, what this means practically is that you're protected from day one, because it is a day one right, there's no length of service, from discrimination, harassment and victimization. Now, discrimination falls into sort of 4 types of discrimination. There's direct discrimination. So an employer cannot say, I'm not employing you because you're disabled or you have cancer. Very rarely does that happen anyway, but there's a protection against that. There's a protection against something known as discrimination by association, which is important to remember if you're the partner of someone with cancer or you're a carer, for instance. Because if someone puts you at a disadvantage because of your association with the disabled person, even though you're not classified as disabled, there are protections in place. There's something called discrimination by perception. So if an employer discriminates against me because they perceive I'm disabled for whatever reason, it's irrelevant whether I am or not, that discrimination by that perception is also a protection. Now, one of the more common ones we see is indirect discrimination, and that tends to be unintentional discrimination on the part of an employer who puts in place a rule that affects everyone, but has the, I suppose, unintended consequence of negatively impacting purely on people with a protected characteristic, in this case, disabled people. So it's a rule that's applied to everyone, but the consequence is it disadvantages people with a disability. Now, in terms of harassment and victimization, I suppose to give you an idea, the definition of harassment is around unwanted, offensive, intimidating conduct. Victimization is about being put at a disadvantage if you raise a complaint about any of the above that I've just mentioned. There's also something, again, without getting too complex, there's also something called discrimination arising from a disability. So if you're absent because of something caused by your cancer or a secondary effect of your cancer, rather than specifically the cancer itself, you may also be protected. Now, when we talk about discrimination, one thing I would say is they are quite complex cases. So it's important to contact, well, you could contact the helpline at ACAS, and I can give you that number. But also, I would recommend legal advice to help navigate the complexities of some of these cases. It's also worth bearing in mind that if your attendance is affected at work, and that's causing you problems, often disability-related absences are dealt with differently. They might be discounted, for instance, or at least managed differently, so that you're not put at a disadvantage, again, because of your disability. And similarly with redundancy, for instance, if you're selected for redundancy, if that's on the basis of your attendance or your performance over a period of time, is that affected by your disability? Now, discrimination is taken seriously, it needs to be taken seriously by employers, because the compensation awards are around loss of earnings, but also injury to feelings. So technically, in theory, there is no cap on what can be awarded, but they tend to be in 3 bands. The lowest band for one-off cases, a highest band for sort of lengthy complaints of harassment, and then a middle band, which is essentially anything that doesn't fit either of those categories. So the lowest award is something like £900. The highest is around 45,600. They can exceed these, but they rarely do. There's also a duty around reasonable adjustments, which I can talk about.